This section reviews how AWS Identity and Access Management, or AWS IAM, supports authenticating and securing access to cloud resources. Before going further in this discussion, it's a good idea to refresh the distinction between authenticating and authorizing. Often the two are linked, but they're not the same thing, and you need to think about both. Authentication is about who is trying to get in the door. And authorization is about what a user or application is allowed to do once they've been granted permission to enter. IAM is a service that lets you control both authentication and authorization to AWS resources. IAM is integrated with most AWS services, and it supports federated identities, which means you can grant access to AWS resources using existing identity systems like Microsoft Active Directory. IAM also supports multi-factor authentication, or MFA. With MFA, a user is required to provide a secondary authentication code from a separate hardware or software device as part of authenticating. From an authorization perspective, IAM lets you create very granular permissions to help you follow the principle of least privilege and grant users exactly what they need for a given role. Here are a few important IAM terms to remember as you start to work with IAM. IAM resources are the things stored in IAM. Users, groups, roles, policies, identity provider objects, these are all IAM resources. An IAM entity is an IAM resource that you can use to authenticate, so users and roles. An IAM identity is an IAM resource that can be authorized to do something. You can attach IAM policies to identities. So this includes users and roles plus groups. Principals are the people and applications that sign in and make requests to AWS. So let's put those terms to use. To control access to AWS resources, you create IAM users that can sign in to AWS. You attach policies to those users to define the permissions they'll have. You can also put users into groups and attach policies to the group, defining a set of permissions for all the users in the group. Roles are similar to users in that you can use them to authenticate and authorize access. The important difference with roles is that a role is not designed to be uniquely identified with someone. It's intended to be assumed by anyone who needs it. When a person or application assumes a role, they get access through temporary security credentials that are only valid for a limited time or for that specific session. There are two broad types of IAM security credentials used to authenticate IAM entities. The first is a username and password that you can use to log into the AWS Management Console. The second is an AWS access key. Now, an access key is a combination of an access key ID and a secret key. An access key is used to run commands from the AWS command line interface, the AWS CLI, and to make programmatic calls to AWS. Now that we've plowed through the basic components and terminology, let's talk best practices. Your student guide describes this list of best practices for securing access, some of which you also learn about in other parts of the course. I want to highlight just a couple. Whenever possible, opt for temporary credentials, even for human users. And if you need to use longer-term credentials, rotate access keys. To help secure access at scale, use AWS organizations to group accounts and control resources centrally. And use AWS CloudTrail to help you audit activity on your AWS accounts. The final best practice on the list should be followed as soon as you set up an AWS account. When you first create an account, you have one sign-in identity that has complete access to all AWS services and resources in the account. This is the root user, and it's critical that you protect the root user. You should limit its use and monitor any root user activity. To protect the root user, create a separate IAM user for your day-to-day administrative tasks, and only use the root user for those tasks that require a root user to perform. Your student guide outlines the steps to sign in as the root user and create a new admin user for day-to-day activities. For users that require long-term credentials, it's a best practice to add users to groups and attach policies to the groups. IAM users in a group inherit permissions from the group, and you can add and remove users from the groups to quickly grant or remove access. As noted earlier, whenever possible, use IAM roles to grant temporary credentials that aren't uniquely associated with one person. Your student guide provides additional details about use cases for roles, and it includes a diagram illustrating 3 examples of using roles to access AWS resources. Here are the key things to remember about using IAM for securing access. The root account has full access to AWS resources, so don't use it for day-to-day administration. For long-term credentials, attach policies to groups and add IAM users to the groups. When possible, use roles to provide temporary security credentials and grant permissions to users or services.